everyone, I'm Hone, and it is Core Set 2019 Full Set Limited Review Week here on my channel. As the week goes on, I'm going to cover every single card in the set, give you my thoughts on all the cards in the set for limited purposes. So far we've covered white, and we're going to go forward, of course, tomorrow by looking at black. You can find a link in the description below for a video on how I grade these cards. Now let's get started. First up, we have Ether Tunnel, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and can't be blocked. I don't like this card a ton, mostly because the creature you put it on has to already be pretty good. It doesn't just make any creature good, it makes them better, but at a pretty real cost. Like all auras, this opens you up to easy 2-for-1s from your opponent. It can also pretty much be useless if you're behind and can't attack anyway. It doesn't make your creature a better blocker, really, just a better attacker. I think you'll play this as a win condition in some of your decks, but I think you'd rather just have one of the mini flyers we're going to encounter later on this list. Though I will say, if you put this on the green mare in this format, you're just going to win the game. So if you have the green mare, which we're going to talk about later this week, who has hexproof, and you have Ether Tunnel, then that's a whole other story, and that's actually probably going to just end a lot of games, sort of like we've seen with the win in Jade Guardian in the past. Overall, though, I think this is a C- with the caveat that, again, if you have the green horse, kind of ridiculous. Next, we have Anticipate, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This is, a card we've seen before. It's kind of like Opt, which we saw really recently. It's fine, a good way to get deeper into your deck, but it doesn't actually do that much. It is going to be a 23rd card in a lot of decks, and if you manage to build a Spells Matter deck, which is what the blue-red deck is mostly going to be, it does go a little higher, but I think it's just a C. It's easy to cut, it's easy to play. If you have a lot of playables, might not play it. Next, we have Aviation Mage, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 bird wizard at common. It has flying, and when you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Aviation Mage gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Poor Windrake. There was a time where a 3-mana 2/2 vanilla flyer at common was pretty good, but the last few sets have really shown us some power creep on the Windrakes. We had the kicker one in Dominaria, the one who gave other stuff flying in Ixalan block, and now this thing. 3 mana for 2/2 flyer is a pretty good rate, so adding this pseudo prowess ability makes it a pretty nice comment. Your opponent will have to think twice before attacking into or blocking this if they have X3s, because who knows what you might have in your hand. It's a C+, a good common that you'll probably play 2 or 3 of in a lot of your decks and feel fine about. Next, we have Aviation Pioneer, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/2 human artificer at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a Thopter token, which is a 1/1 artifact creature token with flying. This is a really good common too. We've seen cards pretty close to it before back in Kaladesh and in Magic Origins, but not these exact stats. But you were paying 3 mana for 2/3 worth of stats, and the 1/1 has flying and is an artifact, which is relevant in this format, especially in blue-white. I think this is one of blue's best commons, and a C+, and I can even see it maybe creeping towards a B-. It's about as close to a B- as you can get without quite being one. Like, right now, I don't think about myself first picking it and loving that idea, but it may turn out that I do. It depends really on how the format specifically shakes out. Next, we have Bone to Ash, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant. It says counter target creature spell, draw a card. We saw this card a few sets ago, and it was fine. I don't normally like counter spells that cost more than 2 mana, or that can only counter one thing, but by adding card draw to a counter spell, you're really powering it up, since this becomes an automatic 2-for-1. Now, it's still going to be painful when your opponent can play around this just by not casting a creature, and you leave 4 mana up for nothing, but just be smart with it. Don't try to hold it up the whole game, just reach a point where you can't do anything else anyway, and that's probably your time to cast it. Having one of these in your blue decks is fine, though I don't think I'd go much deeper than that. I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Cancel, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant that says counter target spell. I think Wizards is contractually obligated to put Cancel in every standard format. That's what it feels like anyway. It's not that good in most limited formats, and what I've seen so far leads me to believe this format's going to be reasonably fast, and Cancel isn't really going to work out great for you here. I actually think it's a little worse than Bone to Ash. That's how big of a difference drawing a card makes. I'm willing to pay 1 more mana for it. I'll do my usual counterspell soapbox thing here. Feel free to skip if you've heard me say it before, but I just want to make it clear, counterspells are not removal spells. They're not as good as removal spells basically in any way. I know many people think of them that way, at least when it comes to creatures, but they aren't, and that's because with removal you don't have to leave mana up to use it at the exact right time. The counterspell, you do. So cheaper counterspells, like those that cost 2 or less, are miles better than a 3 mana one that doesn't do anything else. Leaving up 3 mana is a massive opportunity cost, and the things you could have done with 3 mana on your turn are probably just as impactful as whatever you might counter with this. If your opponent doesn't play into your cancel, it's really going to hurt you. That said, even an expensive counterspell like this one has its place coming out of sideboards against decks with a Bomber 3. It's worth maybe not getting to use all your mana once or twice during a game. I think it's like a C- overall. You'll play one in some blue decks, but you'll also cut it a lot. Next, we have Departed Deckhand, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 2/2 Spirit Pirate at uncommon, and it says when it becomes a target of a spell, sacrifice it. Also says it can't be blocked except by spirits, and for 3 generic and a blue, it makes another creature you control also unable to be blocked except by spirits. This is a really strong, aggressive card for blue. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that is unblockable the vast majority of the time, and in the late game it turns into an incredible mana sink that makes your other creatures nigh unblockable. Sure, your opponent can target it with any spell, including a combat trick, to kill it, but if it didn't have that downside, it would just be insane. It would have to be rare at least, right? I think it's a first pickable, uncommon, a card you're going to love in basically any blue deck. Even if your deck's a more controlling one, this ability can win you the game. If it's a more aggressive one, obviously it's even better. It's a B-. I think you first pick it in a lot of packs. Next, we have Disperse, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant that says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. We've seen this card and cards like it a lot lately, and they don't disappoint. The flexibility of bouncing any non-land permanent instant speed is nice, and 2 mana is a fair cost for that. You can just do a ton of things with it. Bounce spells frequently just give you some tempo. That is, your opponent plays like a 5-drop, and you pay 2 mana to bounce it to make them do it again, and that's nice, but that's really just the base of this card. Sometimes you can actually trade cards with your opponent, or blow them out, like if they try to put an aura on something or use a combat trick. Those situations will arise, so be ready for them in this format. This is one of blue's better commons, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Divination, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common sorcery that draws 2 cards. We just came from a format where this overperformed, but Dominario was super slow. In most formats, Divination's fine, but certainly not the kind of card you look forward to casting either. I'm going to be skeptical and go on the lower end here, give it the grade that I think it probably deserves in most formats, and that is a C-. Next, we have Jin of Wishes, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/4 Jin at rare with flying, and it enters the battlefield with 3 wish counters on it. You can pay 2 generic and 2 blue and remove one of those counters to reveal the top card of your library. You may play that card without paying its mana cost. If you don't, exile it. Yeah, this was strong last time, and it will be strong this time. A 5-mana 4/4 flyer is already Air Elemental, which is like a B-. Add this activated ability, and it gets way stronger. Sometimes you'll flip a land with this, and that will kind of suck, but hey, at least you can still play the land. You're still getting card advantage if you hit 3 lands with the ability, and you'll usually do something better than that. I think this guy moves all the way to A-. He will just let you overpower your opponent on board between his own impressive stats and the wishes he grants you. Next, we have Dwindle, which for 2 generic and a blue is an enchantment aura at common. It's an enchant creature. It says enchanted creature gets -6/-0. When that creature blocks, destroy it. I like this spell. It's a cool yet simple design. Blue almost never gets premium removal spells while other colors do, but I think this gets pretty close. Typically, a blue removal spell would only have the first line of text on this card, the -6/-0 part, and that would be an okay removal spell. But instead of leaving an obnoxious blocker behind forever, Dwindle makes sure that that creature can only block once after you put the Dwindle on it, and then that creature goes away. I'm a fan. I think this is arguably blue's best common, but I'm still hesitant to call a card that doesn't completely remove a creature like premium, but it's about as close as you can get, and I think it's even worth first picking. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Essence Scatter, which for 1 generic and a blue is an instant at common, and it says counter target creature spell. This is a solid counter spell. Sure, it can't hit non-creatures, but the vast majority of spells in Limited are creatures, and the efficient 2 mana this costs means you aren't giving up a whole lot by leaving mana up. I think having one of these in your blue decks is going to happen a lot. I'll give it a C. Next, we have Exclusion Mage, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. Say hello to what is probably blue's best uncommon and a contender to be my favorite card in this set. If you know my content, you know I love Mana Wars, and it has been a while since we've had a 3-mana 2/2 that can bounce something, and that's what we have here. Cards like this are valuable because they allow you to develop your board while you set your opponent's back a bit, all with one card. This is a first pick quality uncommon and a solid B. Next, we have Frilled Sea Serpent, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 4/6 serpent at common, and it has an activated ability that costs 5 generic and 2 blue, and it can't be blocked until this turn if you play that ability. If your blue deck is lacking finishers, this seems like the kind of thing that can get it done for you. Basically a really bad Gearseeker Serpent. This is nothing special. It costs a ton, and if your opponent does anything in response to the activated ability, you may as well pack up your cards and go home. but you could do worse as a finisher. I'm going to give it a C-. I mean, usually you're going to hope you find something better, but if you have to have something that can win you the game in the long run, this can do it. Next, we have Gearsmith Prodigy, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/2 human artificer at common, and if you control an artifact, it gets +1/+0. So this is a build around for an artifact deck, and not a very exciting one for limited anyway. It might have some implications for constructed, since it's basically a 1 mana 2/2 there. I think you should basically never play this in a deck that doesn't have any artifacts, and it's probably like a C in a deck that does. That means it's like an F in a lot of decks and a C in a deck with a decent number of artifacts. It's still not going to be great though. I mean, if you're playing a 1 mana 2/2 on turn 6, it's not going to make a huge impact on the game, and that's what this will be a lot of the time. But it is fine. You'll play it in your blue decks that have a decent number of artifacts, just not very excited about it. Next, we have Ghost Form, which for 1 generic into blue is a common sorcery, and it says up to 2 target creatures can't be blocked this turn. This has some potential, especially in a Spells Matter deck where this might pump your guys while also making them unblockable, but it does also ask you to be a blue deck with a significant number of creatures that are worth making unblockable, and that isn't something a blue deck can always promise you. Plus, a lot of their best creatures have flying as well, so making them unblockable isn't that relevant a lot of the time. I'm pretty skeptical of this for now, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Horizon Scholar, which for 5 generic into blue is a Sphinx, an uncommon one. It's a 4/4 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2. Last time we saw this, it was good, and if you didn't play during Theros, this is pretty comparable to the scry Sphinx we just saw in Dominaria. Truth be told, that one might actually be better. It's 1 less mana for 1 less power, but everything else about it is the same. Still, this is a good card. It gives you a win condition and a sizable flyer while helping you draw better in the later part of the game. Making sure you increase your chances of drawing more gas and fewer lands goes a long way in the late game. This is first pickable in weaker packs, and you can even splash it, and I think it's worth splashing in decks since it only has 1 colored mana, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Metamorphic Alteration, which for 1 generic into blue is an enchantment aura at rare. It's an enchant creature. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature, and the enchanted creature is a copy of the chosen creature. This is kind of a weird card, but I think it is actually quite good. It's very flexible. You can put it on your opponent's best creature to make it whatever the worst creature on the table is, and you can use it on your creature to make it whatever the best creature on the table is. That is pretty strong for 2 mana. Obviously, it's kind of useless in some situations where the downgrade or upgrade just isn't significant enough, but I think this will pull value frequently enough that I'm going to start this format by taking it early. I think it's a solid B. Next, we have Mirror Image, which for 2 generic into blue is an uncommon shapeshifter. It's a 0/0, but it enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature you control. It's an interesting design as a one-sided clone, and while it has some problems, for instance, you can't play it on an empty board, overall it's pretty good, as it will give you a second copy of whatever your best creature is. In the later game, that's probably worth 3 mana or more. It also gets better when you copy things with Enter the Battlefield triggers. This card is definitely harder to judge than your typical clone, but I think it's a decent one. I don't think it's one I want to first pick yet. I could see being wrong about this card because it's sort of a weird one, and the composition of the format may mean that it's even better than I'm thinking, but I think it's a C+, which is still a pretty solid card. Next, we have Mistcaller, which for 1 blue is a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard at rare. It has an activated ability, sacrifice Mistcaller until end of turn. If a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. So this is a card that was printed to hate on things in Constructed. That's its main purpose. That's what it wants to do. It's not going to do much in Limited. It's basically just a 1 mana 1/1 in Limited. You might occasionally go up against somebody who has like a Bone Dragon or whatever, in which case, having it in your sideboard doesn't hurt. But most of the time, it's completely useless. It's just a 1 mana 1/1, which isn't worth playing. It's not worth taking up a card in your deck. And so for that reason, I think it's an F, with the caveat that there might be some very narrow situations where it's an okay card to have in your sideboard, in which case it's a D. Still not a great sideboard card, just because you're not always... You could draft this format 30 times and never have Mistcaller be relevant, basically. So that's the reason I don't think it's a great sideboard card, even. Next, we have Mystic Archaeologist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard at rare, and it has an activated ability. You can pay 3 generic and 2 blue to draw 2 cards. I like this card a lot. A 2 mana 2/1 isn't doing a great job on the vanilla test, but you could do worse, especially on a creature with an incredibly powerful activated ability. How good this is will depend to some extent on how slow of a format this is, but if games are going long at all, this is just going to win you the game because of the obscene card advantage it generates for you. It provides flood insurance. If in the late game you can't stop drawing lands, guess what? If you have your Mystic Archaeologist in play, it'll draw you out of those problems with all the mana that you're drawing. This means it's fine to play on turn 2 and super powerful in the late game. Not something many cards can say. I think this is first pickable and I'm giving it a B. Next, we have Omen Speaker, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, use Scry 2. I love scrying, and I'm happy to see Omen Speaker is back. Decent stats for a defensive deck and relevance at all stages of the game thanks to Scry makes this an appealing card to me for my blue decks. Still, it isn't something incredible, but it is a 2-drop that you're going to be playing in your blue decks. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Omniscience, which for 7 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare enchantment that says you may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. Have fun trying to cast this in Limited. This isn't Dominaria all over again, where getting to 10 could happen. This format looks like it will be at least average speed instead of glacial. But even if you do get to 10 in Limited, guess what? Your hand is going to be empty because the game has been going on for so long and you had to use your cards to get you there, and you can cast any cards you draw because, guess what? You have 10 mana. So being able to cast them for no mana doesn't really make a difference. So this is basically a 10 mana do nothing in Limited, and it's a straight up F. Next we have One with the Machine, which for 3 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery. It says, draw cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among artifacts you control. Obviously, this isn't going to be good in every deck. If your deck doesn't have any artifacts with reasonably high converted mana costs, I think you want to have at least a 3 in play for this to be good, and a 2 in play is, acceptable. You just can't play this, though, if you don't have enough artifacts with those mana costs are higher, and it's just going to be an F in that deck. This will be a blank card, a useless card a significant portion of the time, and you can't afford to put that in your deck. There will be times where this can draw an absurd number of cards, but I think it will usually get you between 2 and 4, which is still pretty good for the right deck. But don't go after this early. See if you were getting a decent number of artifacts first. Even if you get there on artifacts, it won't be that hard to run into awkward situations where this is just dead in your hand or close to it. So I think it's a C+ at its best in a deck that has a bunch of artifacts in it, which is probably going to be the blue-white deck. Next, we have Patient Rebuilding, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard, then you draw a card for each land card put into that graveyard this way. This is an interesting card. In Limited, it does have a very real chance of milling your opponent to death, but I think most of the value comes from drawing extra cards. Milling is sort of an inconsistent strategy in Limited. There are a few other cards that mill in this set. We're about to look at another one of them, and there's also Millstone. But it's just such an inconsistent strategy because you're generally, if you're trying to mill your opponent to death, you're not impacting the board at all, and you're spending mana on a resource that your opponent, it doesn't really matter how few cards are in your opponent's library until they're out of cards in their library, right? So you could spend the whole game getting them down to 1 card, but if you're doing that, they probably killed you. And that's generally how I feel about mill cards. However, this one does a lot more than just mill people, and for that reason, I think it's actually pretty good. Most of the time, you'll draw 1 off of this every upkeep, and that's nice. Sometimes you'll get to draw more, and sometimes you'll get 0. I'll let Frank Karsten do the math on all these outcomes, but my feeling is that the typical interaction will be drawing 1 card. 5 is expensive for a Phyrexian Arena, and it's an enchantment that doesn't impact the board at all, so there will be states where you just can't slam this on turn 5 and hope you survive. If this format turns out to be a grind, it will be better, but I think I'm going to start it at C+. Next, we have Psychic Corrosion, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment. It says, whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So back-to-back cards here that ask you to be interested in milling your opponent. Problem is, 1 is rare and 1 is uncommon, and there isn't enough milling elsewhere at lower rarities to sort of tie this deck together. Patient Rebuilding is far better than this, though, because it lets you draw cards. It doesn't just mill, and that's all this does. Admittedly, the 2 of them together would be pretty ridiculous, and definitely fun to try to do in this format, but I'll believe a mill deck exists in this format when I see it. It just isn't possible in most formats, and I'm going to give this an F. Next, we have Sai, Master Thopterist, who for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 legendary human artificer at rare. When you cast an artifact spell, he creates a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and he has another activated ability. For 1 generic and a blue, you can sack 2 artifacts and draw a card. Obviously, this is a build-around. I think your average deck in this format is going to have like 1 or 2 artifacts in it, and if that's what you have, you probably shouldn't play Sai. Though he isn't horrendous on the vanilla test, he certainly isn't good. And that means he's something like a D- in your typical limited deck in this format. However, once you end up with an artifact-heavy deck, he becomes completely insane. Making Thopter tokens and having the ability to turn artifacts into cards is incredibly strong. While he does have a bad floor, his ceiling is so high that I think risking a first pick on him is worth it, since I think he can get all the way into the A range in a deck with 7 to 10 artifacts, in which case he's at least an A-. Next we have Salvager of Secrets, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. I think it's fair to compare this to Gitu Chronicler and Dominaria. It will serve the same role in a deck. Unlike Chronicler, it can't come down early and protect you in an emergency, but it also costs 1 less and comes with more power, so I think they're comparable. We've seen other cards like this too, and they're basically always nice cards for blue and limited. Buying back removal spells is especially good. That said, it doesn't fit into every deck ever. If you have like 2 instants or sorceries, this isn't what you want to be doing, and to reflect that, I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Scholar of Stars, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 human artificer at common, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control an artifact, draw a card. So we've seen a little bit here that blue has an artifact subtheme. The blue-white color pair especially is interested in artifacts, and this is a build around who has grades that are very far apart. A 4-mana 3/2 is horrendous, so you don't want to play this in a deck where you can only very rarely trigger the draw a card part. If your deck can consistently trigger that, though, this suddenly becomes pretty good, moving into the C+ range. Basically, don't take this early. Other people won't be either. Take it if you end up with some artifacts, and it'll work for you. Next, we have Sift, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery that says draw 3 cards, then discard a card. This is a solid card draw spell that I think basically any blue deck will feel fine about playing one of. It's just a great card to cast in the late game to pull you ahead of your opponent on resources. In the early game, though, it just rots in your hand, so if your deck is really aggressive, it may be a little less appealing, but it is solid, and I plan on casting this a decent number of times, and I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Skilled Animator, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human artificer at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 5/5 for as long as Skilled Animator remains on the battlefield. This is another all-or-nothing build-around that cares about artifacts. This thing is downright bad in a deck without enough artifacts, but in a deck where you have like 6 or 7, it can be pretty good. It's basically an F if you don't have enough artifacts. And the kind of tricky thing with this is that you ideally want non-creature artifacts to be the target of this, because if you're targeting an artifact creature with it, you aren't gaining as much value, as you will only be improving the creature, so the total amount of power and toughness gained is much lower. Its all-or-nothing nature means it's a straight F in your typical limited deck, but I think it moves into the C+ range in a deck with enough artifacts. Next, we have Sleep, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says, tap all creatures target player controls. Those creatures don't untap during that player's next untap step. Cards like this are hard to represent properly with a grade. This card is at its best in an aggressive deck. People sometimes think of it the other way around, but there's a pretty basic reason why this is better in an aggro deck. Your opponent's creatures are tapped for 2 rounds of blocking, and they're only tapped for 1 round of attacking. This is the kind of card that can just straight in games because suddenly your board of 10 power can just bash into your opponent a couple times. It isn't terrible in less aggressive decks since it can buy you some time and you could still use it to win the game late, but it's definitely the kind of card that is best when you have a board state that can punish your opponent. This card has an enormously high ceiling, and anyone playing a creature-heavy blue deck and limited will love this and have this be one of their best cards. Still, I don't think I would recommend first picking it because not every blue deck will go down that road, and I'm going to start it at C+. Next, we have Snapping Drake, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Drake at common with flying. Another French vanilla reprint, and we have seen functional reprints of this and color-shifted versions of this all over, like we just had Avon Sentry. Like all those that came before it, this is a fine 4-drop and flyer to have in your deck, but it's nothing special, which means it's a C. Next, we have Supreme Phantom, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 spirit at rare. It has flying, and it's a spirit lord, meaning it gives all your spirits, other spirits, +1/+1. On its most basic level, Supreme Phantom is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer. Those stats are pretty okay on its own, probably like a C-. Certainly not the kind of card you get really excited about playing or anything. The fact it is a Spirit Lord is cool, but how many spirits are there in this set? Can this thing really go crazy in a Spirit Tribal deck? The answer is no. You aren't going to end up with like a 10-spirit deck. There is 1 at uncommon in blue and 1 at rare in white, and that's it. So I think this should just be graded as a 2-mana 1/3 because it isn't realistic to see it doing much more than that, and as a result, I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Surge Mare, which for 2 blue mana is an uncommon horse fish. It's a 0/5. It can't be blocked by green creatures. When it deals damage to an opponent, you may loot, which means you get to draw a card, and if you do that, you discard a card. And for 1 generic and 1 blue, it can get +2/-2 until end of turn. I think this might be the weakest mare in the cycle. Starting out as a 0-5 for blue-blue is kind of rough. Yeah, it can block okay, and sure, you can make it be a 2-3 or 4-1, and it has a nice trigger when you hit the opponent, but I think this one is the one most likely to stay in sideboards. This is because the stats just don't lend themselves to just any blue deck, only the more controlling ones, and this is going to play really, really well when it's unblockable, but when it's not unblockable, it's kind of medium. I think this is a solid C or so, but I have the other mares higher. Next, we have Switcheroo, which for 4 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery that says, exchange control of 2 target creatures. We see cards like this from time to time, and they're really inconsistent. Some games, they'll be incredible. You give them your 2-2 for their huge bomb, but there will be plenty of times it just rots in your hand because there isn't a trade worth making. Because of its inconsistency, it isn't really a card I like to play. If your deck has a high number of token creatures, or disposable creatures in general, or your opponent has a large number of bombs, it does get better because the trades will be worthwhile more frequently. But most of the time, I just don't think you run this, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Tezzeret, Artifice Master. He's a Planeswalker for 3 generic and 2 blue. He's a legendary one, of course. He's Tezzeret, he's mythic. He has 5 loyalty coming in. His +1 creates a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. He has a 0 ability that lets you draw a card, and then if you control 3 or more artifacts, you draw 2 cards instead. And his emblem is, his ultimate gives you an emblem for -9. At the beginning of your end step, search your library for a permanent card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. I think this is arguably the strongest card in the entire set, at least for limited. That's where I have it in my early thoughts about this format. Things may move around a bit as I talk about and think about these cards more. But for now, I think this is the most powerful card in the format. But what makes this so good? Well, he comes into play with pretty high loyalty for a 5-mana Planeswalker. He can protect himself and serve as a win condition at the same time thanks to the Thopter tokens he makes. And, oh yeah, he can also draw you a ton of cards if you're in the market for that. He does get a bit better in a deck where you can really stack the table with artifacts, but he can also just fuel himself. He can make 3 Thopter tokens and then start drawing you 2 cards a turn, which is a pretty good way to just win a game. Meanwhile, his emblem is also basically game-ending. He does everything you want a powerful walker to do. He can help pull you ahead from behind, and he's going to end a lot of games. He's a solid A, and again, right now, I'd say there isn't anything you should take over him. Next, we have Tellurian Scholar, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human wizard at common, and that's it. It was better than most people expected in Dominaria, but that was because of its creature type. Wizard does not matter at all in this format, the creature type, so you're just getting a 3-mana 2/3. So yeah, don't play this unless you're desperate, and that means it's a D. Next, we have Totally Lost, which for 4 generic and a blue is a common instant that says, put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. We've seen this a lot, and it's always solid. It isn't efficient, but unlike a lot of blue spells that interact with your opponent's creatures, this one actually lets you trade for a card, since it puts the card back on top of your opponent's library and essentially replaces their draw with a creature they already had in play. So this one gives you both tempo and a card, but to be fair, the tempo you can get from this is limited because it's a 5-mana card. Sometimes you can get a 2-for-1 if a combat trick or an aura is involved, and that's great. I think you play one of these in almost any blue deck. After that, I don't know if you want to play more just because it is a little clunky, but it's a solid C. Next, we have Uncomfortable Chill, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant that says creatures your opponents control get -2, -0 until end of turn. Draw a card. If it wasn't a cantrip, this would be like a D-. Adding the cantrip effect helps salvage the card, but it still isn't going to be good. It is sort of like a fog effect, and sometimes you'll find a way to make it so you kill a creature with its help, and that'll be nice, but I don't think it's anything special, and I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Wall of Mist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common wall and a 0/5 with Defender. If your deck has a lot of flyers, or is interested in being defensive early, or you have the Elder Dragon who likes defenders, this might make your deck. Apart from those scenarios, and even in some of those scenarios, you probably shouldn't be playing it anyway, though. I think it's a D+. The last card we're looking at is Wind Reader Sphinx, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a Sphinx at rare. It has flying, and it says whenever a creature with flying attacks, you may draw a card. So a 7-mana 3/7 that draws you a card every time it attacks is probably already worth playing. The high toughness also means that the Sphinx can do a good job of blocking, and then when it is time to go on offense, really help you to a win. Still, for a 7-mana card, it isn't that impactful. At least, that is, if you don't have other flyers around. Being able to play this and attack with a flyer you already have in play is great, and ideally, since this is probably your best blocker, what you really want are other flyers doing the attacking while this stalks your hand. I think on its own, this is probably like a C+, But if you can get 5 to 7 flyers, it definitely moves closer to the B range. I think that this is worth considering using a first pick on because of the reasonable floor and the high ceiling. If this format turns out to be really fast, this is the kind of card that will slip, but I think you can probably play 1 7-drop in most decks. That's the last blue card we have to look at in today's video. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about every black card in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my limited review, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.